Yes, we have today with us our quilter, Brenda Hendrix, and she is here at Carver with us. And we have our Carver reporters that are going to experience some things with her and ask her some questions about quilting so that we can learn and show our video in our classroom. Brenda Hendrix.
Oh, it's nice to be here. I enjoyed meeting these young people, and if you'd like to get started, I'm ready.
Okay, now what is quilting and when did it begin in America?
Okay, quilting began in America because people needed something to keep them warm in the winter, and they made quilts.
How do people learn how to quilt?
Well, learning how to quilt, women, and they taught their daughters, they sewed, and they would take pieces of fabric and sew them together and make quilts for their bedding.
What materials did the earlier quilters use for their quilts?
Most of the time, what they used to make their quilts out of years and years and years ago would be their clothing that was so worn out that they couldn't wear it anymore. Then they would take that clothing and use it up, tear it up in little pieces and sew it together and make quilts.
What about wealthy people? What did they do?
Wealthy people bought quilts from the people who could make them, and if they wanted something special, they'd have to provide the fabrics for them because
Okay.
you know,
What kind of fabrics did the wealthy people use?
most quilts in the older quilts were made all with cotton because cotton was readily available at that time. And if they didn't have cotton, they might use wool where they had sheared the sheep and stuff. They would use whatever that they had. And a lot of times, where my quilt here that we have on display, the batting is cotton. And if they did not have cotton, a lot of times they would use wool because it would be heavy, it would keep them warm, and they could put it between it, and that way it wouldn't scratch them.
Very nice. Go ahead.
What stories did quilts tell, and what information did we learn about from the quilts?
Quilts do tell stories. When I was a little girl, my mother would sew for us, and she'd make our clothes. And all the little pieces of fabric she had left, she would give it to my grandmother. And my grandmother would make us quilts, and we waited to get those quilts so we could look at them and say, I had a dress made out of this piece, and I had a shirt made out of this piece. And those kind of stories they told. And then quilts that were applique, which an applique quilt, they would have a picture on it, and sometimes those pictures told stories, or if they would embroidery to tell a story.
Well, are there many styles of quilts?
There are. This particular quilt we have laying out here is a patchwork quilt, and the reason you can see that is because all these little pieces would be like a patch that you could sew on your pants or your shirt to patch. So when they put them together, they just called it a patchwork. Appliques would be like if you had a picture, which we'll use this as a little, like if we had this picture of this block and we wanted it on a plain block, then we would take this block or this picture and then we would sew it onto that, and that's an applique block. And there's just many different kinds. There's where they just take strips of material. Rag quilts, which rag quilts is mostly what the old quilts were made out of. There were garments that were no longer usable to wear. They would take those ragged garments and make rags and then sew them together.
What are you going to demonstrate about quilting?
Well, I'm going to show you a few stitches on quilting, because whenever you make a quilt, you'll see here we've got a quilt, we call it a quilt sandwich. We've got the top, which is the pieced quilt here. We have our batting, that's the middle part, and then our lining, which is the bottom part. So we've got lining, batting, top. We've got a quilt sandwich. And when we put those together, we sew them. Somewhere I've got glasses. We sew those, and we use small stitches. And the reason for using small stitches is so that they will stay together. And you just sew in there. And now I catch, and when you're catching, when you put this needle down, if I didn't have something under there to catch, and I use my finger, most of the time I'll put tape on it so I don't stab myself.
What do you have on your finger?
I have a thimble for pushing my needle, because needles are sharp, and I don't know anybody that can push a needle without a thimble, because they will hurt you. But you push it through and catch with your underhand, and some quilters use thimbles on their underhand. I've never been able to do that. I just am not coordinated enough. but most of the time I put tape on it to keep from sticking myself. But here today, I don't have any tape, but so far I haven't stuck myself. But I have done that, and I'll wind up with little specks of blood on the back side of my quilt, so I have to wash it. But this is quilting. This is hand quilting. There's also machine quilting, where you can use just a regular sewing machine if you're making a smaller project. And if you're doing a big project, they have what they call a long arm quilting machine. And you put your quilt on that and you just move it around and quilt the whole quilt.
Well, we are really excited because each one of the students will be doing their own individual block. And Brenda Hendrix has graciously told us that she was going to do the sandwich for us. So each student will have their own little quilt block. So we're going to be using this in our classroom. So we're really excited.
Yeah, we've discussed this. They're going to each get a 12-inch block of fabric with their blank canvas, which they'll be allowed to do their own design. Now, I did this one quickly last night because I'm partial to this block. I really like the tumbling block for children. And you use, now I used crayons, and these are a special crayon. It's a fabric crayon. And a regular crayon will not work. And you draw your picture on here, and when it's completed and I come back and get them, when you draw it, it's going to be really light colored. So it's going to be deceptive. And you don't have to do a lot of hard coloring. If you'll see, here, see, I just kind of swirled it around, and then when I set my die, it kind of spread it out. Same thing.
How do you set your die?
With an iron. Because I'll iron them. You have to put a tissue on them so you don't get the dye of the crayon on your iron, because crayon on iron is not good. But there you can do it. That's a blank canvas, and everybody is an individual. So every quilt block, even if you draw the same picture, it's going to be your personal quilt. And there are other ways to come up with patterns. Now I'm big on the internet, and I'll go to the internet, and you'll see here, I went to the internet and I was looking for a pattern to make a heart. You see this? And so I did. I got my pattern, and then I cut out all my blocks, and I can put them, I look at this, and you can put it together, and it will make a heart.
And then what will you do?
And then I sew it together, and then I quilt it, and I use my hearts for corner blocks in baby quilts. And I monogram the baby's name on it because it makes a special gift for a baby. And that's what I do with them. Now I have put them in other quilts just whenever I thought a heart looked good. I have books that I'll go to. You'll see these books have patterns. There's so many different kinds of patterns. You see? You see? Pattern books. And I know girls like butterflies. There's a butterfly pattern. And they're all cut out of little pieces of fabric and sewn together. Or you can draw it with the crayons. And I take pictures when I go to quilt shows, or if I go to flea markets or somewhere and I see a quilt that I like, and I'll take a picture of it, and then I'll go home and I'll load it on my computer and blow it up, and then I'll figure out how to make that pattern.
We appreciate you coming to Carver and know making our quilts will be a great opportunity for us.
Well, you're so welcome. I did bring a few other things for you guys to look at. Another way, whenever we were talking about quilt tops, well, if you have a little piece of fabric and you like just little pieces of it that's particular, you can what we call fussy cut, where you just cut out those little pictures and sew them together. And I have a little small quilt top that I made there, and that's called fussy cut. And then I have some more little patchwork blocks for you.
So what is a top?
The top is the part that's pretty. Your top is always pretty. I've never seen a quilt that wasn't pretty, because I love quilts, and when I see them, I'm going to do my best to admire it, because I mean they are beautiful. I love quilts. I grew up quilting. I've been quilting since I was 8 years old, which is much younger than you guys, because my grandmother always had a quilt, And her quilt frame, rather than using a lap frame like this, she had a frame that hung from the ceiling. And before I started quilting, we played under it. My cousins and I thought it was the best playhouse in the world. And then whenever I started quilting, I've been quilting ever since.
Well, we do appreciate you coming. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me. It was nice to meet you. It's nice to meet you too. Okay. The boys and girls here at Carver are going to be making their own personal little mini quilts. And we're going to give them each a piece of blank fabric, which will be their blank canvas. And they'll use fabric crayons, which they are a specific crayon, and they do say fabric. They are Crayola. They look just like a regular crayon, except that it does say fabric. And it's the only kind of crayons that will work on the fabric. Then they will draw their picture, and when they draw it, you will see that it is a lighter color. I could have wrote Carver on there, couldn't I? Let's put Carver. And it's lighter, but then whenever their heat set, it makes the colors just pop right out. And you can do any pattern that you want to, but you do not get too close to the edges because I have to have space to sew them together to make your little mini quilt. And one thing that I always encourage young people to do when they're making their blocks is to be sure and initial it, or at least put their name or just initials and the date, or at least the year, because this is something you're going to always remember. But when you're 50 years old and you're looking back now, I remember when we made these little quilts, but I was in the 5th grade. Well, you don't even have to think about it. You can look right there, and it says 2014. And I always encourage that because that's a good way to know what you've done. And a mini quilt is a keepsake that you can keep for yourself, or you give it to your mom or grandmother or someone special that you want to share. Okay, you have any questions about the mini quilts? You girls are getting there. The girls are trying to put together, I gave them a pattern sample with the directions to make a heart. And they did pretty good. That's a little confusing. If you've never, let's see, I'm trying to do it upside down here. It's a puzzle. And it just goes right together. If I can get it there. And then you fill in all the blank spots with the little pieces of white, and it makes a heart. Okay, I'll finish it up.